If you can watch a television show made in the US or England or in Mexico, and you see a performer that you recognize maybe from Telemundo, even though that performer may not be a movie star, if you can recognize them and you go, oh yeah, that's the guy from that soap opera, that may be enough for other people to see the picture that's very small and click on that picture. The point I am making, though, is you need to be dealing with professional performers. We will talk more about that tomorrow when we learn how to negotiate with agents and learn how to hire actors from Hollywood. If you don't have any of those, you at the very minimum need a compelling story, a very interesting story that few people have seen, or maybe a story that can only be told here in the Dominican Republic. And finally, and this is what the emphasis is going to be on for most of the lecture, we need to make sure that we have all of the legal elements. Can we turn that down a little bit? Or is that me? Okay. Yeah, it's just a little louder. We need to make sure that we have all the legal elements so that the distributor, at the end of the day, knows that when they distribute this film, they will not be sued. I want to talk a little bit about genre. One of the big genres that we have in the United States today is the comic book that's being turned into movies. Now, I do a lot of work in the comic book field, and what's exciting to me is just how popular these movies are becoming. So in the past several years, since 2008, we've had over $7 billion come into the box office just from Marvel's movies alone. And if you take a look at the past 10 years, the #1 box office film in the world has been a comic book movie 40% of the time. That's a lot. Recently, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a couple of weeks ago, grossed $35 million in its opening weekend. Now, here's the takeaway here. I think that comic book movies are just going to continue to grow. And there's an advantage to working in the comic book field. You don't have to have a Batman or a Superman or a Spider-Man. But here in a country like the Dominican Republic, if you start creating your own comic book properties, the fact that it's a growing genre that people want to see has a lot of advantages. The advantages of working with a comic book movie, you have a built-in audience. If you have a published comic book that people like, people are going to go see the movie. There's a pre-visualization that you have with a comic book. Here's what I mean by that. About 20 years ago, when I was producing, if you wanted to go into a Hollywood studio and pitch people an idea, do you have that term down here, to pitch an idea? Is that okay? You might bring in your screenplay. But if you brought in storyboards, people would say, whoa, you're trying to tell the director what to do. Now, people buy comic book. And what are comic books? Comic books are storyboards. They're pre-visualized movies. So as a creator, what I'm seeing very often from my creator clients is I am seeing screenwriters pairing up with visual artists, creating a comic book, getting them distributed, and then based on that comic book, getting a sale to Hollywood. The nice thing about this route is it's cheaper than making a film and showing around that film. I'm not trying to talk anybody out of making a film, but what I am saying is for those screenplays that you may have out there that are big budget screenplays but you don't have the money to shoot them, instead of keeping them in a desk, maybe what you can do is partner up with an artist, develop it into a comic book for just the cost of working with an artist and a little more, distribute it, and then, with that series, approach a studio. And I've seen it done over and over. Who watches The Walking Dead? Okay. Even if you don't watch it, you're aware of The Walking Dead. Started out as a comic book. There's so many properties on TV now which started out as comic books. So this is it's a growing area and one which Hollywood loves. It's lucrative, there's a lot of money in it. You can also, if you have a comic book work, you can turn it into a movie, a toy, a video game, licensing and apparel. So there's a lot of money that comes from that initial property. And as I said, it's easier and cheaper to create than creating a low-budget film which may not realize your vision. It's cheaper to draw the world blowing up than it is to film the world blowing up. Let's talk now exclusively about film. When I say exclusively, I mean we're going to talk about film as a media. All of the creative work we're doing now, we're going to assume goes into a film property, but we can get some of those creative ideas from comic books, from novels, from stage plays. But in order to do anything with it, we have to make sure that we have the legal rights to that film property. So let's understand, what is the film property? It's a collection of intellectual property rights. Let me pause there. We're going to talk about intellectual property in a little bit and what that means. But for now, just know that it includes things like the property to the film negative, the copyright to the screenplay of the film, the rights to exploit an underlying work like a comic book, the right to merchandise the film, the right to distribute the film. Any right that you can think of that has to do with controlling the film and selling the film, that's probably going to be part of the film property rights. And the key for you as producers is to control those rights. Now I want to be clear. When I say control the rights, I don't mean that you're going to end up with all of those rights at the end of the day. You will have to make deals and license some of those rights to other people in exchange for money or additional rights. But you should be the people in control of that and be aware of when those rights are being released by you. As I said, pleasing the distributor is key. So you need to have what's called a strong chain of title. A chain of title is the unbroken chain of ownership of all of these rights. We're going to talk about how these rights are created and how to build these links in the chain. For instance, copyright registration. That's going to be your first link. Anytime you license your copyright, you have to have that in a contract. If you work with people and hire writers, make sure you do it in a way that you get their copyright. One of the ways we do that under US law is through work for hire. Now, I don't mean to pick on my fellow attorney. Do you have something like work for hire here in the Dominican Republic?
I'm a US trained attorney.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure, actually, but I can find out. I'll let you know tomorrow.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. And getting permission to use a script in a manner known as an option agreement. We will talk about that today. You have to have I said that enough times? Have to have written agreements. Anytime you're dealing with a copyright, under US law, you must have a written agreement. This is not a time for a handshake, for a, hey dude, don't worry about it, man, it's cool. This is the time for a written agreement. It says so under the law, and to effectively transfer a copyright interest, you must have it in writing, and it must be signed by the person who has that copyright. So a couple of contracts that we're going to be dealing with: cast and crew contracts, writers' agreements, chain of title as we talked about, depiction releases. If we're going to be using somebody's likeness in our films, especially for advertising purposes, we're going to need to have their signature on a release. And music licensing. Music licensing is the area that gets more people in trouble than any other area of licensing that comes across my desk. And I'll tell you, there's a reason for that, and it's really tricky. Under US law, there are actually 2 copyrights in every piece of recorded music. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. I don't want to hit you with too much today, but just know that whenever you're dealing with music licensing, your work is doubled, unfortunately. Now, it probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. The US film industry runs on law. You know, I do a lot of traveling, and every time I talk to people from countries outside the US, and I tell them I'm a lawyer, I always hear the same thing. Ugh, you Americans and your law, you're suing everybody all the time. And I think that's valid. There are more lawyers in the US than there are doctors, which is unfortunate if you think about it. But there's also a reality to that, which means that if you're going to deal in US business, if you're going to deal especially in the film industry, you have to comply with our law. And I wish I was here to tell you differently or to put our heads together and think of a way where it doesn't have to be that way, but I'd much rather give you tools that you can use. So you have to understand these rights that protect your work, and you have to understand them so you can avoid being infringed. So you can avoid being sued for infringement. In other words, if you might think that it's okay to take a little bit of somebody else's work and put it in yours, and that may be true. We have something called fair use of copyright in the United States. But how much can you take without getting somebody's permission? Or when do you need to get somebody's permission if you want to take a bit of a comic book and put it on TV? Well, those are questions that you have to understand before you go ahead and shoot your film. We're going to go into some ways that you can analyze those situations and understand when you're a little bit too close to the line. Contracts must be written, and you have to have contracts to ensure proper payment from your distributors, to allow you to hire union performers like SAG-AFTRA performers, and to protect your chain of title. And some of the agreements that we are going to be dealing with today are largely going to go to chain of title. And especially, we're going to be talking at the end of the lecture today about how to protect the rights in your screenplay. Let's drill down and understand copyright a little bit more, because for everything that we're going to be doing over these next 2 days, we have to understand copyright as the bedrock foundation, the basic law that is going to control pretty much most of what we're going to be talking about. And I think one way to do that is by understanding some of the problems that we can face. So let's take a look at the legal life cycle of a film and see how copyright and these other rights plugs into it. I think there are 4 basic time periods of a movie. When you write or acquire the film, when you set up the company and raise money, when you shoot and edit the movie, and finally, when you get a distributor. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes is I'm going to give you all of the big steps that you need to do from a legal perspective in your movies. Again, these are in detail in the book, but I'm going to walk you through how a lawyer thinks about a filmmaker client and the big issues that are in her or his head when it comes to sitting down with that client for the first time. And I hope you'll see at the end of the day just how many different issues we have to concern ourselves with. One of the first things we have to do is we have to decide what type of business is my client getting involved with. Are they going to be a sole proprietorship, a partnership, or a corporation? I'm not going to talk a lot about these entities because I think you may have different ones here in the DR. But the big idea here is that if you're going to treat it like a business, you should set up some kind of business entity. In the US especially, if you are hiring people, if you are taking money, if you're involved in a business that may be sued, you will probably want to create some kind of limited liability business entity. Like a limited liability company, that's the LLC, or a corporation. And what these business entities do is they protect you personally from lawsuits. So if you make a movie, but it's actually your company that's making the movie, and you get sued, it's not you that lose your paycheck. It's not you that loses your car in the lawsuit or your house in the lawsuit. It's your company that is sued. Now, especially when it comes to the entertainment industry, people love to sue. All of the bad things we can say about lawyers are especially true in the entertainment industry. And I'm speaking as a lawyer in the entertainment industry. People will sue if they think that you've taken too much of their stuff. People will sue if you haven't paid them on time. There's so many ways that we can get sued in the entertainment industry. So it really does pay to have a company that is doing all of the contracting for your film. So you want to get limited liability protection. To finance the project, wow, there are a lot of different ways to get money. The easiest, of course, is paying for it out of pocket. Now, not a lot of us have a spare several $1 million lying around in their pockets. So this may not be the best route, but from a legal perspective, it's the easiest. When the client tells me, hey, my grandmother left me some money when she died and I'm going to use that money to make a film, I know that there's one whole line in my checklist that I don't have to worry about. But most of us don't have that kind of money. So we may go into debt, maybe use a credit card and put our film costs on that. We may try to, instead of debt, offer something called equity, which is get investors for our films. We say to somebody, hey, if my film makes money and you give me $100,000 and my film makes money, you'll get $120,000 back. But when we do that, under US law, we must worry about securities laws. This is beyond the scope of what I'll be talking about, but just know that if you don't comply with US securities laws, you can get into trouble not just with people suing you, but also break some criminal law. So any time in the US you are offering money in return for profit, for giving somebody profit, you have to make sure that you do it in the proper way, and unfortunately that can be expensive when it comes to hiring lawyers to help you here. So what's the most common route now, I find, for indie filmmakers is token crowdfunding. Anybody hear of Kickstarter? Or Indiegogo?
Yep.
Okay. So we're going to be talking just a little bit about that, but I would say that more than half of my independent film clients use some type of crowdfunding, and it's really pretty exciting that this is now available to filmmakers. I think maybe if it were available a few years ago, I might not have become an attorney. I just would have done this. We can also get money for our films by using state tax credits in the US. Many states offer some money back if you shoot films in their states. It changes from year to year which state has what money and how much money the state is offering. So it's not something I could tell you about some of the tax laws, and then next year, if I was down here, it would be a completely different picture. So it's not as helpful as understanding token crowdfunding. We'll talk about token crowdfunding more in a minute, but let's now talk about getting the rights to a screenplay. If you want to get the rights to a screenplay, you can, the easiest route, write it yourself. You can work with a partner. You know what, before we go over to that, if you write it yourself, here's what I mean about that. Make sure that if you're writing it by yourself, that it really is all your own work, that you're not basing it on a novel or basing it on a comic book. You can do that, but you're going to have to get the rights to do that first. So when I say write it yourself, I mean a completely new work, a breathtaking genius from your own heads. You can also work with a partner. A lot of people do that. But if you do that, just know that there are some copyright problems that will arise if you don't have a contract with the partner. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. You can hire a writer. Again, written agreement. You can option or purchase a script. Has anybody optioned a script here? Okay, you've optioned a script. Anybody else? Optioned a script. Okay. It is perhaps the most common way in which screenplays are bought and sold in Hollywood, is through the option purchase agreement. And we'll learn why, but as a little teaser, we need as producers to know that a film script that we like is going to make money. And we need to know that we can raise money from a particular film script. So we don't want to pay for the script before we know that we can make money from the film. So in order to bridge that gap, we use an option agreement, which essentially gives us the right to take around a screenplay to different investors to see if we can raise money. And then when we know we can raise money, then we buy the screenplay. That's what an option agreement is. And we'll talk over some very specific deal points on how to do an option agreement in a little bit. We could adapt a screenplay. That's the scenario where we're taking a comic book or a novel and we're turning it into a screenplay. As you might imagine, we need to deal with the person who owns the rights to the comic book or the novel. And of course, we have to protect these rights through chain of title. I'm going to be saying this term over and over until that sticks in your head next time you get on set. You go, chain of title. I know I have to worry about that. Copyright registration, though, make no mistake, is the first step and the key to understanding your chain of title. During the pre-production phase, yes?
So if you register your screenplay here, let's say I've written a screenplay, and you use it, or you try to sell it, or try to produce it in the US, you would have to copyright it there as well?
It depends upon the
Se está escuchando la pregunta.
Si yo tengo un guión
Perdón. Si tengo un guión aquí y tengo la propiedad es mía aquí en la República Dominicana y lo quiero producir allá en los Estados Unidos, tengo también que hacer el proceso de obtener los derechos para mi guión allá en los Estados Unidos.
So I'll answer the English question, which I'm assuming is the same as the Spanish. Whether or not a copyright is valid in the US when registered in another country depends upon that country's status with international intellectual property treaties with the United States. And perhaps the best way to do it from I'm going to put the law aside for a moment and just deal with the practicality of it. In the US, to register a copyright, $35, and you can do it online from there. So you might be able to make a persuasive argument that the Dominican Republic is a party to a treaty to which the United States is, but most producers just find it a little easier to register it in the United States. But that doesn't answer your question as a lawyer. That answers it on a more practical, $35, and then you don't have to argue the issue to the distributor. Does that make sense? When you're in pre-production and you're hiring, you have to worry about employment law. Now, if you're doing this down in the Dominican Republic, I'm not a Dominican abogado, so I can't analyze these laws here. But if you're doing a production in the United States, you have to understand when you're working with an employee or an independent contractor. In the US, we have a distinction between somebody who is your employee and somebody who we hire, but we don't have to pay taxes for. They're more like a worker who comes and works sometimes, but they have their own separate business. So for instance, if I hire somebody to build a prop for me, I'm doing a science fiction film, and I say to an artist, go and build me 50 laser guns. That artist will go off to his or her workshop, build the laser guns, and come back when he's done, say, there it is, pay me. That type of person is more likely to be an independent contractor, because I'm not looking over their shoulders like their boss every day. I'm not giving them all the tools they need to make the guns. They have all that stuff. They're just saying, I'll do the job, I'll give it to you when it's done. Somebody like an actor, however, may be more like an employee. They're there on the set every day, you're directing them in the rehearsals, you're giving them the wardrobe, you're telling them when to show up. We'll see why these distinctions are important in detail later on. But here's the spoiler. They're important because they control how copyright is created by these people. So we have to analyze whether somebody is an independent contractor or are they an employee. Unfortunately, copyright isn't the only reason we have to worry about this stuff. We have to worry about this stuff because under US law, we need to withhold taxes on the federal and state level for our employees. There are also a host of other laws that control how many hours somebody can work if they're an employee, and whether or not they can work in dangerous conditions, those sorts of things. The easy way to think about this is, if somebody's an employee, there's more law you gotta deal with. When we're working with a union, like SAG or AFTRA, the performers union, we must deal with their contracts. Quite simply, if you want to work, did we lose audio? No. Okay. Quite simply, if you want to work with a SAG actor,
Give me a second.
No. You're experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand up.
Parece que el del...
Okay. Check. All right, we're gonna start this off with karaoke music. If you're gonna be, so I guess I don't need this then. Okay, so if we're going to hire performers, we must pay attention and we must abide by the SAG-AFTRA contract. Has anybody worked with SAG-AFTRA actors in here? Okay.
I'm producing, well, I'm Italian. I'm in the Dominican Republic because I'm producing a movie. It's an international movie, though it's going to be set entirely in the Dominican Republic. And I just signed, actually, as a cast lead, one of the stars of the Orange is the New Country.
Oh.
So she's American. And so actually I signed her, and on the contract, it's clear that I will be operating under SAG regulation, even though we are in the Dominican Republic, so SAG is not actually going to, but I am going to give her the same treatment that I would give her in US if I was working, so that's basically the thing.
So in a nutshell, when you're working with SAG, you have to agree to abide by their rules. You can't hire a SAG actor and then write a contract with that SAG actor that's different from what SAG says the rules are. So in a very real sense, SAG sets minimums to how much you can pay the actors, maximums to how many hours a day you can work them, and they will set other requirements for SAG actors. So again, it's more law to deal with, but I think you get a tremendous amount in return. You get a professional performer. In your case, you said you're working with somebody who's a known performer.
Yeah.
And so I presume your hope is people are going to see that actress, and
Also getting the little window on she's under contract with actually with Netflix, so
Right.
that wasn't.
so I know nothing about your film, but I already know that that's a smart move. You know, it's one of the smartest things you can do is exactly what you've done. But just because you're working with SAG doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with contracts. When you're dealing with crew members and cast members, you still write your own contracts with them that says what title they're going to be given and how their credits are going to be dealt with and all of the other issues that we deal with in a service agreement. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. But work for hire is a key issue whenever we're hiring people for our productions. We want to make sure that however they're hired, whether as an employee or as an independent contractor, that the work they do for us, we own the copyright to. Let me say that again. If you are producing a film, everybody who works on that film, from writer to actor to director, the copyright in their work that they do for the film needs to be owned by either you, the producer, or the production company. We need to have words in our contract which say that this work that they're doing is a work for hire. That's a magic term, if you will, in US copyright law. What a work for hire is a work that is produced as a work for hire. The copyright is not owned by the person who made the work, it is owned by the company that hired them. I'll go into more detail in just a little bit about how to create a work for hire. But right now, let's shoot the film. Legal issues involved in production include getting permissions from extras that we may interview on the street. This really is a large issue in documentary filmmaking. When we walk up to somebody and we interview them, we need to have a written release from them saying that we can use their interview. Sometimes a written release is simply not practical. If we're shooting a large bar scene or a large crowd scene or a concert, you're not going to go up to every person in a soccer stadium and ask them to sign a release. So in those instances, we may post a sign which says something like, by entering, you agree to be on film. And when we do that, we also have to make sure that there's a place where the camera is not focused. So right now, the camera that's photographing me is basically in a cone like this. I know I'm being photographed, I've agreed to that. I don't know that you all have agreed to it, but it's mostly the back of your heads. But I would need to, if I'm shooting a scene here, make sure that there's a place, such as the back row, where the camera is not picking up. Because I have to give people a choice to not be on camera if they do not want to be. In order to get permission to shoot in locations, I need, again, written agreements. I may also need what's called a shooting permit. And a permit is a license from the city or the state, a place where the location is. So if I'm going to be shooting in New York City, anybody here shot in New York before? Okay. So did you have to go to the mayor's office for film and TV? So
Well, not me, but the producer, the line producer and the producer company
Mhm.
have to get the right. And in Madrid, I did the same. We shoot in the Palacio Real, in the Real Palace, and in the gardens. Well, we pay for the metros.
Sorry. It's okay if I talk in English or it's better in Spanish? It's okay? We paid for the space, meters. Each meters, they have like a price. So we have to know the real space that we need. You know, if we got a traveling or if we got well, it depends, but you know, you need a space for the camera to move. And not only the camera, I mean the whole crew, and you have the catering too, and you know, you need the space for the sound. So we need to calculate all that because we pay for the meters.
and this is in
Spain. In New York, I didn't. I really don't know what they do, but I know that they get the license, they pay. But I didn't know if it's for the meters like we did.
So in New York, we don't do it that way, which is fortunate, I think. New York is actually becoming a much more film-friendly city. It's always been a good city to film in, but you used to have to get a permit, that is permission from the city, to put down a tripod or to shoot anything in New York City. You'd have to get permission from the mayor's office. We've actually made it easier now in New York. So if you want to shoot in New York, as long as you're not obstructing traffic, as long as you're not blocking people's way, which is perfect if you have a GoPro camera. I mean, so many people shoot with some version of a handheld, whether it's a GoPro or some small camera. Fewer and fewer people are putting down tripods and dollies now as part of their shoots. So you don't need to get permission from the mayor's office anymore if you are just doing a GoPro camera and following somebody as they walk towards you, as long as you're not obstructing traffic. However, if you're using guns, if you're pretending to be a police officer, if you're using car chases, things like this, then you may need to get permission from the mayor's office. And you will need to get permission anytime you're blocking the sidewalk.
What about a Steadicam?
A Steadicam, again, it's going to depend upon, so the question is, what about a Steadicam?
Yeah, but you were over there, so sorry. I will remember next time. Sorry. What about the Steadicam?
What about a Steadicam? So,
Thank you.
a Steadicam again comes down to, are you blocking traffic? So if it's a Steadicam in the middle of Times Square at New Year's, yeah. If it's a Steadicam on Wall Street on a Sunday, no. So those of you who know New York obviously know there are times, I mean, it's always crowded, but there are some places where it's going to be easier to do something like that than others.
I got another question. Can I?
Sure.
It's actually two questions.
One is about New York and then the cities, because New York is very important, but do you need just
to get the I don't know, you can shoot, I mean, you go there, you pay, and then you can shoot in whatever place you want, or you have to tell it? Or each city have different law for the shooting?
Okay. Let me take those questions in reverse.
Okay.
Yes, each city has different laws. As a matter of fact, the town in which I live just outside of New York, in Nueve Jersey. And sounds cooler than New Jersey, right? And in my town, which there's a lot of film. Anybody seen Mad Men? So a lot of the scenes, the outside scenes, were shot in my town. And it's a beautiful town, but if you want to shoot there, you have to pay $500 a day to shoot there. Even if you want to shoot in your own house, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And I called up the film commission in my town and I said, that's crazy. And she said, well, but if we don't know about it. But the point is, if you're going to be bringing trucks and putting them on the street, they're going to know about it. I don't know the laws here in the Dominican Republic, so I can't tell you how this situation is here in the cities here. But most big cities have a film commission which deals with that sort of permit process. But I also want to draw a distinction. I'm sorry, I think you had another question. I just answered the first one.
No, it's okay. It's just, it's a tricky game, you know?
Yes.
So you say New Jersey, but it's the same state. So in New York, you have the ability to shoot in whatever you can shoot in any place you want, any street, and it's the same. But if you go outside or you go to another state, it's different. So it's like Madrid is different. I mean, here it's different too. So, but it's a tricky joke in the state.
Yes.
Because the changes in the same country.
Yes, and especially with the way our law works. One of the things that's very tricky, and you know this as a U.S. attorney yourself, we have different laws in every different state, and then we have federal laws and the different circuits that those. So it's always very strange when I meet an attorney from another country. They might say, "Oh, I'm a German attorney," and I have to say, "Well, I'm an attorney in New York and New Jersey and the United States Supreme Court, but I can't tell you about Louisiana law technically because we have so many different laws in the U.S." But the takeaway tip and trick for location permits, shooting permits, is just check with the local film commission first to see where you can film. You're talking about Steadicams. If you wanted to take a Steadicam on the New York subway, oh, that's a different thing altogether. If you wanted to take a Steadicam on a bridge, that might be the Port Authority's jurisdiction. The point I'm making is that New York City, in particular, there's so many different places and areas that are difficult to shoot or that have special rules that a good starting point would be to go to the Film Commission. Local rules, once you have a permit, also control, well, where you can put your trucks, at what time can you blast the lights in a residential neighborhood, those sorts of issues. A location agreement is the agreement, a contract that we have with the person who owns the property. So if we want to shoot in somebody's house, we need more than a shooting permit. We need also a contract with the person who owns the house. That's called a location agreement. Moving away from locations, we also have to make sure we're shooting that all of the intellectual property we see, the posters that are on the walls, the billboards, the music that's in a radio that somebody has in their car that's playing as it drives by. We have to analyze and see whether or not we need to get permission from these owners of the copyrights. You don't always need to get permission, all right? So I don't want to scare you, but you do always need to analyze whether you need to get permission. We'll talk about that a little more tomorrow. But some of the ways that we get permission is we use licenses. If we want to use somebody's poster, we might need an artwork license or music license for a song that we use quite predominantly in a scene. And if we're using a lot of trademarks, we might need to get permission as well. Yes?
Thank you. I do have a scene, right, in the movie, or I do have a poster, okay, which eventually I would love to try to turn into a production placement, so actually it's cost some money. But do I need would I need any permission in order to be able to use it? I mean, it's just the Adidas poster where Ali is knocking down a guy, and so that's something very fast. It's just a moment, but it's there. So.
We're not going to talk about you in particular for the reasons I said at the top, because I don't want to. There's a filmmaker, and he may have used a sneaker company's poster. Oh, we'll talk about that guy. We'll talk about it a little more tomorrow, but let me give you the quick answer. And the quick answer is, it depends. What does it depend on? It depends upon how long we see that poster. Is it the focus of the scene? Do we make the audience think that the sneaker company endorsed or sponsored or was behind the making of the movie? In other words, the more we use trademarks, and a trademark, by the way, draw a big distinction between a trademark and a copyright. A trademark is like the Coca-Cola bottle or the Adidas shoe, just to name one out of the blue. These are symbols that companies use to make consumers recognize their brand. And the laws that protect how we can use them in our films are different from the laws that control how we can use somebody's copyright. So for a poster from a sneaker company, unfortunately you have two issues. Can we use the trademark, but can we also use the copyrighted poster? Oh, but wait a minute, there's a celebrity in that poster. Now we have three issues. Do we have the right to use the celebrity's likeness as well? Yes, exactly. My thoughts exactly. So it's tricky. But in general, if you are using a poster very briefly, there's a scene where I'm an actor and I'm talking with somebody else, this is the poster, and I'm just walking by and I'm talking like this, and that's all we see, and the camera follows me. That's probably okay, especially if there are other posters behind us. But the minute a filmmaker starts focusing on a particular poster and doing what, as you mentioned, a company might want from product placement, then you may have issues. So the better way to do it is to first try and get permission to use the poster in a manner that you can use for product placement, and do that deal first. But if you can't, because I understand, hey, this would be a good idea, let's just do this and then go to the company later. I get it. If it's like that, then hopefully you've shot coverage that is a scene without that. But without taking a look at how much the poster is shown in the film, the focus in the scene, the length of time, you can't get a specific answer as to that. But those are the things you'd analyze, you'd look at. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Now we're in post-production. Well, you've got to hire post-production staff. You have to deal with music licensing. Well, the easiest way to deal with music licensing is to get stock and royalty-free music. In other words, get music that we don't have to worry about the copyrights for. You could hire a composer to create music. Because of course we have to do another agreement with that composer and make sure that the copyright is ours. Although, to be fair, in composer agreements, these are a little bit different. Composer agreements, very often we let the composer keep the copyright, and there are some ways that some rights that we give composers that we tend not to give other people. The right to maybe use that music on a soundtrack album, or the right to take that music and sell it on iTunes, but we, the producers, might get a cut or a royalty from that. So commissioning music through composers is a very different type of contract than other contracts that we'll see. Pre-recorded music. Okay, you want to go get the latest album from Daddy Yankee or Taylor Swift, or the combo of Daddy Yankee and Taylor Swift, which I would pay to see. And if you have that, though, if you want to use a piece of music that's been recorded before, as I said at the top of class, you have to make sure that you are dealing with the two copyrights. The two copyrights, you have a copyright in the piece of recorded music, in the sound recording, and you have a copyright in the underlying musical composition. Better way to think of this is this. Any musicians in here? Anybody play guitar, piano? One? Just one person in class? Well, good for you. I play guitar. So, you know how you have sheet music and you put it in front of you and you play the music? That is the composition, the musical composition, the notes on the page. That has one copyright. The other copyright is the actual sound recording itself. So the way we know that a version of a song is done by a Daddy Yankee or a Taylor Swift, as I say. And that copyright is owned by the record company. So when we're getting music from a recorded album, we have to deal with the record company and the person who owns the musical composition. As I said, your work is doubled. You have to negotiate with both the record company and the music publishing company. The publishing company is the company that owns the composition. Are we done? No, we have to prepare the credits for the film. Now, believe it or not, and having gone through the film process a number of times myself as a producer and a director, by the time you're doing your final edit and you're getting the credits done, the money's all gone. You're having to run to Kickstarter and get more money. You're tired. You just want this thing done. And having no money and being exhausted is a recipe for legal mistakes. A big one comes in when we forget to put people in the credits. All of those contracts that we were dealing with, especially with the actors, you need to make sure that you are putting in the credit exactly as it appears in the contract. And it's not just the credits in the movie itself, but it's in all the advertising that you've agreed to use their name. So unfortunately, this is really a time where you have to start running back to your contracts and seeing what exactly did you agree to. So you have to pay attention to your contractual obligations, any union obligations of crediting from SAG and AFTRA. Also put in your copyright notice, that's the C in the circle. And finally, but definitely not last, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to argue that what I'm about to say, you should start this process first. There's something called errors and omissions insurance. Has anybody heard of this? Errors and omissions insurance. I didn't know about this when I was producing. I went to NYU Film School. They didn't teach me about errors and omissions insurance. And it's something that a lot of attorneys don't know either. However, if you've done a film and worked with the US distributor, you know that this is something they require. We're going to go into a little bit of detail in a minute about it. But what errors and omissions insurance is this is insurance that protects you against intellectual property lawsuits. So let's say all the stuff I've been talking about, you forget a contract that you needed to have, or you didn't get permission to do something you should have gotten permission for, it's the errors and omissions insurance that will come in and hopefully pay for the lawsuit that you get hit with. So you can see why it's very critical to have this. And we're going to take a closer look at it in a little bit, because understanding errors and omissions insurance and what the requirements are tell us what we need to put in our contracts. So it gives us very much a roadmap of what we need to have from a legal perspective. Okay, now we're done. We can finally distribute the film. Well, the first thing I suggest people do is try to get a traditional distribution deal. Try to get a distributor before you do it yourself. And you may want to go to film festivals to meet distributors. You may want to work with a special kind of agent called a producer's representative to try and get your film to a distributor. Work websites and social media to do that. Get the word out there. And hopefully you'll land a distributor and get what's called a distribution rights acquisition agreement. Wow, that's a mouthful. Basically, it's a distribution agreement. And you need to make sure before you self-distribute that you have tried all the routes to attracting traditional distributors. Do-it-yourself distribution, also known as DIY distribution. You can try to take it to theaters yourself, and in the US, we have film bookers whose job it is, we hire them and their job is to put the film in different movie theaters around the country. We can try to do that job ourselves. It is quite time consuming, but I have a number of clients who've done it successfully. We could try and press our own DVDs and sell them ourselves, or use a company that does that. Although, quite frankly, I don't see too many DVDs anymore, or Blu-ray. I think most people are doing it online now. So I think the amount of physical assets we have for distributing a film are really being reduced. So DIY online distribution, from my perspective, is just a growing trend, and this one is a sinking trend. We may need to work, if we want to get to a Netflix or to an iTunes, we may need to deal with a special type of distributor called a content aggregator. And this distributor solely focuses on taking our movies and putting them online to those kinds of pay sites. Netflix and iTunes both require content aggregators. And last, and maybe not least, is YouTube. As we all know, YouTube is free. There are some ways of making money by putting your film on YouTube, but it really requires a lot of people to watch your film in order for it to be worthwhile. So I saved this for last, because once you've given it away for free, it's very hard to attract a distributor who then wants to pay for it. So that, in a nutshell, is all of the issues that when I deal with my clients who are filmmakers, I walk through all of that. There are other issues and sub-issues, but as a roadmap, I think you can see just how many legal issues you gotta deal with if you're dealing with the US film industry. So it's quite a lot. One of the maps that we have to guide us, I mentioned this before, is the errors and omissions insurance. Errors and omissions insurance is required before we can distribute a film. And as I said, it protects us against intellectual property lawsuits. And one of the nice things about dealing with errors and omissions insurance is that these requirements very closely track a lot of what I just put on the board. And you have it there in a couple of sheets of paper, the things that you will need to do. So, for example, errors and omissions insurance is going to require consent to use the likeness of all people appearing in the film, just like we'll do with depictions and likenesses for actors. We need all the rights to use literary, musical, film clips, photographs, and other materials used in a film. We need to make sure that you're working closely with a lawyer or a producer who knows the law to make sure that all of these procedures are being followed. And we need to finally be able to prove that these insurance requirements have been followed by showing all the contracts to the distribution agreement, to the distribution company at the end. Now, if you can't meet any one of these requirements, what do? Because sometimes contracts just fall through the cracks, as we say in English. Well, this is where you have to lawyer up if you haven't done so already. One of the things I teach in the Indie Film Clinic at Cardozo Law School is how to work with distributors and with E&O insurance carriers on behalf of clients to prove to the carriers that, hey, I know you asked for a depiction release, we didn't get one, but here's why it's still okay. See, we as attorneys can write letters to the insurance company and say, I'll give you an example. Let's say we have filmed a street scene and it's a documentary. And I stopped somebody on the street and I asked them a question. And I gave a brief answer and I used that shot in my movie. And I didn't get permission. Well, under New York law, as long as I'm photographing somebody in a public space on a city street and I'm not using their likeness for advertisement or for marketing purposes, I'm using it for creative purposes or news gathering purposes, I don't need written permission. And as long as I, the filmmaker, have said, hey, I can use this in my film, right? They said, yeah, sure, and then gave me the answer. From a legal standpoint, I'm fine. So getting back to the errors and omissions insurance, errors and omissions insurance will require me to have written permission from everybody. But if I go to my lawyer and I say, okay, we didn't get this, can you write a letter? The lawyer then writes a letter to the insurance company explaining why you don't need written permission, because under New York law you don't in that situation. Then the insurance company says, okay, we'll still give you the insurance even though you didn't have that. So it's a case for working with an attorney on those areas where you couldn't get permission. And at least in New York, we have an indie film clinic that helps producers for free deal with those sorts of issues. Now I want to launch into a discussion on intellectual property and talk specifically about copyright for a little bit. But I want to make sure that we're doing okay on time. So I have a little after 11 now, right? And we started a little bit late, so I'll leave it up to you, Cesario. How long can we go for?
I think we can make up for the time that we lost.
Okay.
Are you agree with that? Do you agree with that? Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we'll go for another half an hour and take a quick 5-minute break then, and then
Right.
and then finish up. Does that sound good? Because I know there's only so much law, no matter how entertaining I might be doing a little dance up here, it's still law, and I get it. So I don't want you guys to be bored for the rest of the day. All right, so let's talk about copyright law in particular and some of the contracts that we need to have. Well, I like to think of copyright law as the heart of the work that we're protecting, and contracts as sort of the engine which drives these deals. These are actually from my new book on comic books. I get to work with a comic book artist. It was really cool. Intellectual property, a term I've been using throughout this lecture, so let's explain it. Intellectual property, it's really a bunch of different types of laws. We have copyright law, which protects original works of expression, such as a film or screenplay. We have rights and ideas. There are, under US law, a number of different ways in which we can try and protect pure concepts. Now, I'm going to say at the outset that it's very tricky, very difficult, and the law doesn't like to do it. There are ways of doing it, and we'll talk about it, but just know that if you have your choice between trying to protect just an idea for a movie and a whole script for a movie, it is far, far easier to protect the script for the movie than just the idea. Trademark, we talked a little bit about. Those protect titles and labels and slogans and marks that we use to distinguish one product in commerce. And we have rights of publicity, and these protect the right to commercially exploit somebody's likeness. That was the example we saw before when we were dealing with the person on the poster. But by and large, the heavy lifting that we're going to be needing a law to do is going to come from copyright. So let's understand just a little bit more about copyright law itself. First of all, it's really easy to create, and this is the cool thing about copyright law. A lot of people think you have to register it with the government or do something special in order to create a copyright right, but you don't. All you need to do is just put something creative down in a tangible means of expression. In other words, a snowman would probably not do it because it will melt, but if you put something out of clay, something that could last, or your hard drive of your computer, or you write a quick sketch on a piece of paper. All of those things, the moment you finish that, they're protected by copyright law. So it's very easy to get a copyright. You don't have to do anything but create. However, the copyright that you create, even though it may be very quick to create, can last a long time. It will last up to 70 years after your death. This is under US law. The time period is different depending upon the country. So in the US, it's your lifetime, or if you work with a partner and one of you dies, the surviving partner's lifetime, plus 70 years. That's a general rule. Know right now, though, that depending upon when that copyright was created, if it was created before 1976, different time periods and how long that copyright lasted would apply. I'm not going to go into that today because it's long and boring, and there's a chart in my book which will save us all a lot of time. But know that if it's created today, 70 years up until 70 years after your death, it will last. Unless it's a work for hire. Remember I was talking about work for hire before? It's a special case. So work for hire doesn't last as long, potentially, as a copyright that you create and hold on to yourself. Now I said that you didn't have to register the copyright in order to have one, but you should register the copyright. There are a lot of advantages to registering the copyright. Now this was the scenario I mentioned before where you register it with the United States Copyright Office. As a matter of fact, there's the URL, those of you who want it. Only costs $35 to do. If you register your copyright with the United States Copyright Office and somebody infringes your copyright, what I mean by infringement is when somebody uses your copyright or takes your copyright, steals your copyright, does something with your copyright without your permission, and you sue them. You sue them for copyright infringement. So if somebody takes your copyright and you sue them for copyright infringement, if you've registered that copyright before it was infringed, you can sue them for a lot more money. So it really, really pays off to take that $35 and register your copyright. There are other protections you get too. I won't go into them now, but just know that it's better to register your copyright before you distribute your film. Copyrights are the key rights we're going to be dealing with because they give us so much. It's actually a bundle of rights. It gives us, anybody who has a copyright to something has exclusive rights. That is, they're the only person who can do the following things: to copy a film. They're the only ones who can authorize whether that film is distributed. The only ones who can say whether we can put it on in a movie theater. That's called public performance. The only one who says that we can display stills in a gallery. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for filmmakers, one who owns the copyright is the person who can authorize derivative works to be made from that copyrighted work. Derivative works. Let's unpack that concept. A derivative work is the exclusive right to create other copyrighted works based upon the original work. So I'll say that again. If you write a screenplay and you own the copyright to that screenplay, you are the only person who can authorize that that screenplay gets made into a movie. If you have the right to make the movie, you are the only person who can authorize an action figure or a t-shirt that uses a still from the movie. Controlling the copyright in the derivative work is the key to everything that you need to know for copyright law. That is the goal. Control the derivative work right, and you control anything that can be made from your screenplay. All of these, movies, TV shows, DVDs, video games, toys, all of these are derivative works of a movie screenplay. Now, as I said before, you may, as a matter of fact, will probably need to give part of these derivative rights to people. So if you have kept the right to the screenplay, and let's say you shoot the movie yourself and you keep that copyright, if you want to work with a television company that wants to take your movie and turn it into a TV show, now, I'm not talking about broadcasting your movie on TV. I'm talking about turning it into a TV series. Then you're going to be granting them that right and giving away that exclusive right. So you won't have that right anymore until it comes back to you, if at all. So just know that you may have to cut up these rights when you are distributing your film and when you are trying to market your film. But you need to have control of these rights at the outset so you have the most flexibility. I like to take a look at the contracts and the workflow of the copyright as follows. Imagine this is an engine of a car, and in the top are the different ways that fuel can go into the car. We have copyright created by sole authorship. That's just you yourself pouring a copyright into this machine. Perhaps getting a license from a comic book owner to use their comic book, or working with independent contractors who you pay, working with collaborators, or maybe hiring people. All of these are ways in which copyright can be created. And of course, they flow out, and we are licensing them out to movies, merchandising, publishing, and other ancillary areas like merchandising of video games. If we think of it this way, I think it's helpful because you can see how we have to keep track of the copyright going into the machine as well as the copyright coming out of it. And make no mistake, these have to match. You obviously can't grant a copyright to something you don't have up here. So part of the trick is understanding what rights you're getting so you know what rights you can give out. Money goes through the copyright goes through the machine, and in return, we get money back up to us. Yep, that's the remainder of my film school education doing animations like this. Okay, I want to talk through a couple of danger zones in copyright law, and then we'll take a brief break, clear our heads, smoke a cigarette, those of you who smoke, and then come back fresh and eager to deal with more law. Okay, how I want to start, though, is I want to start by, again, going to that E&O insurance. Here's why. Remember I said it was a roadmap? Let's take a look and see how it identifies some of the problem areas with screenplays. When we deal with E&O, we are required to make sure that we know where the idea in the screenplay comes from, the sequence of events and the characters. We have to know and we have to have control of this stuff. That's what the insurance company requires of us. We need to do a copyright report. In other words, we have to go to our attorneys and we have to say, okay, attorney, take a look at this chain of title of the screenplay and make sure that we have the rights to make the movie from the screenplay. And finally, before we select a title to the film, and by title in this meeting I mean a name for the film, Star Wars, before we do something like that and decide upon it, we need to do what's called a title report to make sure no one else has used that title. Now, this is this one company that I took these requirements from one particular company. Other companies have different requirements. I will tell you from a legal perspective that there are a lot of movies that have the same title. So this is an area where if you had a film that was similarly titled to another film, a lawyer might be able to analyze this and write a good persuasive letter to say it's okay even though two films have the same title. So, for instance, there's a Battleship Potemkin. Those of you who've gone to film school have probably seen this film, 1920s film. Eisenstein, was it Eisenstein? Yeah, Eisenstein. Old film, classic film, but if you did a film today called Battleship Potemkin, it was a different plot and it was different characters and it was maybe about a couple who fell in love when they watched the film Battleship Potemkin in film school. There's not a doubt in my mind that I could write a persuasive letter saying it's very different, the audiences are different, no one is going to be confused that one movie is the same as the other movie. The point I'm making is that even though it says that you need a title report, the key to this is approved by the insurance company, and that's where, again, you can get a good lawyer to argue to the insurance company why just because the film had the same title as another one, it's not going to be a legal problem. Ideas, protecting ideas. How many people have pitched to a production company? Anybody pitched to a production company? Okay. Anybody a production company to whom screenwriters have pitched? Anybody have pitched to? Okay. You know then that it's probably the producer's biggest fear, right? A writer's biggest fear is you go into that meeting and you have a great idea and you go in and you tell the production company and they say, yeah, it's not for us. And then a year later you see your idea on the big screen, right? And those of us who've done a lot of pitching, I used to do a lot of pitching in LA and Hollywood, and it was a real hard decision to make if all you had was an idea because you felt like you'd lose control over it and the company would steal it, and how do you protect against that? The plain and simple truth is that the law doesn't like protecting ideas. There are some ways of doing it, but to sue somebody over taking your idea almost always results in you losing. You can't copyright an idea. I hear this a lot. People say, hey, I have a copyright in that idea. You don't. Under US law, actually, if you look at the US copyright statute, it says no copyright for ideas. You simply cannot copyright an idea. But you can copyright the screenplay that uses that idea. In other words, in your minds, make a sharp distinction between the idea. There's a rebel force and they're fighting against intergalactic bad guys. Well, that could be anything from Star Wars to Guardians of the Galaxy to Battlestar Galactica, any number of films. And the minute you make a screenplay for Star Wars or you make a screenplay for Guardians of the Galaxy, that's the part that can be protected. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it, right? Because that idea could be any number of things. I mean, ideas are the building blocks of creativity. So US law doesn't want to stop other people from using those same building blocks. But at the same time, you may have a really, really unique idea, right? You may be the one who thought, okay, high school chemistry teacher has cancer and he doesn't have any way to pay for his treatment and his family, so he makes meth. That's a cool idea. That's one that I hadn't seen before. I don't know that anybody saw that before. But yet, just on an idea level, if that's all that Vince Gilligan had pitched around without any protection, that is something that the law would have a very hard time protecting. But there are some ways to protect it. You can protect your ideas through contracts. Maybe. In fact, most of the time not. Here's how you can protect it through a contract. Is if you go into a pitch meeting and you're pitching your concept to somebody and you say something like, listen, before we get started, I just want to make sure you understand this is my idea and that you're not going to take it and do something with it without paying me and without us doing a formal contract, but you're going to pay me if you use this idea. And if they say yes, then maybe you can protect that contract, that concept. But I will tell you in practice, no one is going to say yes to that, because all of the people that you're pitching this idea to will have been trained well, hopefully by their legal departments, not to say yes to that. And there's a reality to this. You know, one of the last jobs I had before I turned to the dark side and became an attorney, one of the last jobs I had is I worked as the head of development for a television production company. And I listened to a lot of people pitching me ideas. And it quickly became apparent to me that, wow, a lot of people have the same idea. And so it's quite the reality of the situation that when some big event happens, whether it's 911 or Hurricane Katrina or the earthquake in Haiti, that you have a lot of people who are inspired by that, who want to talk about that, and who make movies about that. And so from the studio perspective, the idea, unfortunately, is not the valuable thing. What's valuable is what you, the producer, can bring to the table in terms of elements. So if you're pitching an idea for a TV show, it's more valuable to say, not just here's the idea, but here's the movie star who's agreed to be in this film. Or here's the great director that's excited to work on the project. Remember I was talking before about elements. This is where your elements do the work for you. You will see contracts, however, when it comes to pitching to a studio. And there's sort of two different contracts that fight each other, if you will. One is called a non-disclosure agreement, and the other is a submission release. A non-disclosure agreement is the one you would love if the studio signed. And that is a contract in which they agree that they're going to keep your idea a secret. That this idea is your property until they purchase it from you. And that they're not going to use your idea without permission. But as I said, they're not going to sign this. Who may sign it is if you're working with a smaller production company and you already have a film under your belt, and so you have what we call leverage in the situation. In other words, you have the power because this production company really wants to work with you. So you may get them to sign something like this. But in the classic indie film situation or the indie producer where you're pitching to Hollywood, forget it. As a matter of fact, they're going to send you a submission release form. The submission release says exactly the opposite of the non-disclosure agreement. The submission release says that you agree that there's no contract between you and the production company. You agree that the production company can use your idea if it gets it from another source. You agree not to sue the production company if it uses a similar idea to yours. Now, this may sound like they're being crooked. But if you go back to the example I gave before, where the production companies listen to a lot of the same ideas every day, it has to protect itself because it's going to hear a lot of stories about terrorists in 911, or it's going to hear a lot of stories about Hurricane Katrina, and so it needs to make sure that it can use the filmmaker who brought in the talent, not just the first filmmaker who came in to pitch the idea. But the best way to deal with all of this, write a screenplay. Write a detailed treatment and copyright that. Don't try to copyright your concept or your idea. Protect the copyright instead.
Octavo Festival de Cine Global Dominicano, porque yo soy loco con el cine. ¿Y tú?